Right, welcome to the Wire Legacy Conference. I don't have a fancy soundtrack behind me, but we do have some substance, we do have some ideas to share with all of you in thinking about the school-to-prison pipeline and mass incarceration. My name is Carla Shedd. I'm Assistant Professor of Sociology and African American Studies here at Columbia University, and I am delighted to convene this panel for the Center for Justice here at Columbia, headed by Geraldine Downey, with our Assistant Director Cheryl Wilkins. So we are just delighted to talk about what I think is the most fascinating part of the Wire Show, Season 4 with the kids. And I will say, as a graduate student at Northwestern, my advisor, John Hagan, who is a huge criminologist, he's won the Stockholm Prize, which is like the Nobel for criminology. And I was writing my dissertation, and he was like, Carla, you're not watching The Wire? And I'm like, my advisor's telling me to watch TV, I'm trying to write this dissertation. And then I said, oh, I should be watching this. So I started watching The Wire when season 4 was live, as it was going on. And I had to go back and catch up on the first 3 seasons. I did it 2 or 3 episodes a night. I thought Snoop was killing me in my sleep. I mean, it was just so intense. But I had to devour this show. And so I'm really still delighted to say season 4 was the best. And I want to talk about some of the issues that I know many of you are interested in because you're in this room. And it's not just going to be me talking about it from a research perspective. We have other researchers and activists and scholar activists who have done work around the issue of school-to-prison pipeline, but we have some experts in the room. We have 4 New York City high school students who are going to talk about their worlds and their experiences in thinking about the school-to-prison pipeline. So as a sociologist, I always want to bring the people to the fore, and so I brought my expert panel today. So the structure of today's session, and we actually have a little bit more time because of the next session, so we'll see how this works. We'll feel the rhythm. But I'm going to sort of give a broad overview and show some images and just really get you to think about what a school-to-prison pipeline means. We have a lot of rhetoric around the issue, but I want tangible sort of understanding so we come to this conversation with a foundation that's pretty even. And then we'll have Dr. Desmond U. Patton, who's here at the Columbia University School for Social Work to talk about his research on internet gangbanging. Very compelling, interesting. And then we'll have Mariame Kaba, who is an activist. She's an amazing sort of model of how you do action around issues of substance. She's still of Chicago, or have you made the move yet? Still of Chicago. She's coming to New York. She's bringing her talents here, and there's a fight everywhere. So we have these voices here. Our students are here in the audience, going to take notes, going to be ready to be discussants. So we'll sort of transition after we do our setup of this issue and bring the students to the table and kind of yield the mic to them. So I'll moderate a bit. You're going to engage with us. It's going to be so exciting. So, there's been a resounding call for a 21st century human rights movement. I don't know why it wants to skip the slide at all. There has been a resounding call for a 21st century human rights movement that will respond to the damage that mass incarceration has done to the collective realization of our American ideals of opportunity, fairness, and equality. I argue that our nation's criminal justice system and how we treat the most vulnerable who are ensnared in its ever-expanding grasp is the standard by which we should gauge our realization of these ideals. As an urban sociologist, I use surveys, interviews, systematic observation, and ethnography to explore societal structures like neighborhoods, schools, and courts to see how they shape the trajectory of young people's lives. Today, I want to give an overview of that work. My research agenda has moved from tracking adolescents' experiences within and navigation through what might be free places that are potentially penalizing, like urban schools and neighborhoods, to documenting and analyzing the different social and legal factors that impact young people's interactions with the formal justice system. So our agenda today is to think about the legacy of The Wire. I put here, caring about the kids, or is it just the kids on TV? Thinking of these penalizing places, neighborhoods, and schools, and what I like to use, instead of school to prison, I like to use the term a carceral continuum, and I'll tell you a little bit about that. Whereas my first book explores adolescents' experiences within and navigation through schools and thinking about their perceptions of injustice, their contact with police, their understanding of inequality and opportunity, my next book looks at the actual justice system. And if we see the work of the juvenile justice system, we have to think about how young people are leaving schools and ending up in this institution. And so Loic Fauquant, and he's a sociologist at Berkeley, who's used the phrase carceral continuum to theorize about expanding systems of social control and punishment. And so my mission as a sociologist is to think about how do we test and show evidence of this theory? How do we think about the processes that structure the relationship between schools and prison? There's a great deal of rhetoric, as I've said, but how do we track it empirically? So major questions we might want to think about are, one, how do schools and neighborhoods socialize young people to the criminal justice system? And two, how do young people's linked institutional experience influence their placement on and movement along the carceral continuum? So I'm thinking about the linking of schools, of neighborhoods. None of these things exist in a silo. And so if we put them together, we see the continuum of experiences, but we also see the impact of these larger structures and what their missions are. These questions are even more important when you know that the largest number of kids who drop out of school in Chicago, it happens between 9th and 10th grade. So these trajectories start to diverge very quickly of the kids who are going to end up here at Columbia University versus those who may end up in the criminal justice system. And thanks to many sociologists and criminologists, we also know that high school dropouts have a 60% likelihood of incarceration in their lifetime if they are Black and brown. So these are the populations that I am most concerned about. Now, as schools and neighborhoods have become more and more securitized during the era of mass incarceration, we can look and see these varying levels of severity and these interactions. And so how might a journey on the carceral continuum begin? Let's go to Brooklyn. Can we see this? A jail-themed playground. A jail-themed playground remained on the grounds of the Tompkins public housing projects in Brooklyn for 6 years until in 2010, media attention stirred public outrage. Under pressure, the New York City Housing Authority painted over the facade, and through this example, we can see ways in which young people are introduced to the justice system without setting foot in a jail or a courtroom. Now, why might this matter? People say children have, play. You can see jail here. You can see bars. Can't really turn down the lights. There's so much technology going on. But if this neighborhood is also one of the biggest feeders to the actual justice system, this is not child's play. This is very much literal and real in the minds and lives of young people. This is one of the New York City famous police patrol towers. And if we think about this police tower, it's a classic example of what's known as the panopticon. This idea that there's an all-seeing eye, and if you elevate the sort of view, the surveillance of the police, it's darkened windows. No one necessarily has to be in there, but it conveys a message to you. We could be watching you, we are watching you, therefore you should watch yourselves. And so there was one day I did a talk at a high school in this neighborhood, and I had to cross 125th Street, where this police tower was. So they're young people who are going to school, encountering this tower. What does it mean for them? Do they think that it will make them be safer? Or do they see it as a means of watching them and putting the criminal gaze or the criminal eye onto them? And so these are just things that I want us to think about. We can think of a classic image from urban education from 1957, this iconic moment of the Little Rock Nine being led into Central High School. They are surrounded by National Guardsmen who are protecting them as they're going in from angry whites who are hurling, perhaps racial epithets at them. There were rocks thrown, all types of violence done to young people in the service of integration. And this is meaningful because our schools have resegregated to a point that's worse than this time period. So what does it mean to think about the role of police when they were protectors for young people who are now protecting young people from each other in their service? This is a photo outside of Fenger High School in Chicago. The police were very much present after the fatal beating of Darian Albert, who was beaten to death after a fight that spilled out of, sort of boiling up within the school. It ended up on the streets in what was known as a safe zone for the kids who went to Fenger High who came from a different neighborhood. And so my book kind of looks at these changing conditions in housing and schooling, the closing of schools, the demolition of public housing projects that make it so that young people are moving across boundaries of race, boundaries of gang lines, that they never had to do so before these changes happen in these larger institutions. And so the outcome of Darian Albert's beating is a testament to us thinking of something that we might see as extreme, but it's also something we can think about in terms of schools making it so these young people have to interact with each other in a way that it possibly wouldn't happen were it not for these changes in housing and schooling. So the embeddedness of police in these spaces in Chicago, which I know the most about in terms of the school environment, police officers too are mandated to be present in every high school. And so we can think about this as it started in the 1990s. This was before the wave of Columbine and mass shootings. This was in a response to what was seen as high criminal levels of violence in these cities like Chicago and New York. If you see the police departments in New York City, the force is bigger than that of Boston's police department. So we have police embedded in these spaces, and what is their purpose? How are they viewed? How is their presence experienced, and what is the sort of impact or outcome of that? And so you see things in Chicago where they were doing roll calls outside of the schools as a sort of show of support or presence, but there might be some differences in how young people might view their presence too. And so my work was to get that on the record and see how young people actually felt about this presence. You can see the cameras there, the physical space, this idea that we would call the police to keep our kids safe. That is in contestation, I can say. Police might not make everyone feel safe, and we can talk about even some of the movements happening right now in Chicago, Mariame, around this issue. And for one of the schools I studied, to think about the fact that you have this one message from the Chicago Public Schools, children first, main entrance, building for their future, but first you must be searched. It says upon entering this building, you may be subject to search. And so for many of the schools that I studied, particularly on the south side, I didn't study the west side, I had a sort of north-south divide in my examinations. You had the kids who had to be subjected to physical pat-downs every day going into school. And so if you see them sort of lined up to be patted down or to be scanned even, what sort of purpose do you set in their minds in terms of what they're about to do once they enter this space? Are you having them worried about vulnerability, thinking, well, if they're searching us for weapons, what if someone really gets one in? Instead of thinking about that math test or thinking about that science test. So with this idea of a new panopticon, this sort of new expanded version of surveillance, of control, we have the metal detectors, we have the embedded police officers, we have visual patrols of police, by police of schools where actually live surveillance feed goes from the school to the Chicago Police Department. And so they say, you know, in the event of an emergency or terrorism, we're right there and we're on call, but this is something that's happening every day. And so how might we think about police sort of watching what should be routine interactions of kids going to school? What sort of framing are they using in their minds as they're watching this video? Is it protection, is it safety, or is it something else? The reciprocal records agreements where the school will share with the police if something happens in the school, calling the police. And there have been, you know, sort of turns in how we are mobilizing the police in schools, thanks to much of the activism of someone on this panel in Chicago. And so we'll talk about that, where police officers are not necessarily called for the smallest offense. And we'll, you know, have students talk about some of what these offenses are. Uniform checks, there were kids who were turned away in some of the South Side schools if their black and white was not, you know, the pants were not black enough. And so if you're sent away for your pants being too faded, what does that mean about how you're showing up to this space and what really matters? Now, I talk in the book about a universal carceral apparatus, and this means that we have the metal detectors across all schools. We have the police departments across all schools, so we can activate these sort of systems as we need it, depending on who is in the space, depending on who is the perhaps population that's being controlled. So this is, you know, the metal detector from one of the most prestigious magnet schools in Chicago. And I'm close on it, but you actually can walk around it. It has this wide, airy entrance. The students only get scanned 1 out of 20 days. They talk about the legitimacy of that and say, if I wanted to bring a gun, I would just bring the gun the day after they scan us. I mean, it makes no sense. So they're thinking about this. They're looking at these routines and practices and trying to figure out what it means and does it really make them feel safer. And so this difference in being able to walk into this magnet school is in contrast to not being able to skip over the metal detector in the school on the south side. Everyone walks through, then you get a pat down. And so you can just see the difference in sort of how young people across these different school environments may approach schooling. And this school, you know, top grades, everyone's pretty much going to college. This school, you know, a graduation rate of about 50%. And so how might we look at the outcomes of achievement, of what people's next steps are, and think about how the structures and sort of practices within schools may facilitate the different pathways that young people take. Now, one of the young people I talked to at Harper High School, which has been in the news, it was on an Oprah school swap where they took kids to Harper from a suburban school district, and these kids were like, we have to be scanned, what, they don't have an Olympic swimming pool, what, they don't have instruments, what, you know, and the Harper kids went to this suburban school, and many of them had no idea that what they were experiencing was not the norm. They had no idea that they really had it so bad. And so in my work, I think about the perceptions of relative deprivation, their assessment of like my situation or people like me. If I don't have a comparison, I think it might be okay. I think this is the norm. And so when we disrupt the norm, how do we understand those young people from Harper who went to the suburban schools, saw that things were much better for these kids, and they're like, we want the same things. How do you think they felt when they went back to their school, when they went back to a place that Dwayne, one of my students I interviewed, talked about? He said, Harper feels like a prison, to tell you the truth. You have to stay in the classroom, use the bathroom when they tell us, eat lunch when they tell us. It's like a jail. Security guards ask, well, what's your ID number when you're in the hallway? Just like in jail, you gotta say your ID number and not your name. It's no different than jail. It's just that we up in here for 6 hours a day, every day. That's why kids act bad. They feel like they're trapped in here. And so his assessment of what he felt in schools is different. He sees them as, not necessarily protectors, but making them feel sometimes even more unsafe or thinking about these interactions. And so we might want to understand the kind of nuance of young people and how they might understand these issues themselves. And so I wanted to sort of end with this, or pause if we think, they came in and painted over that jail facade for the playground, but does that change these young people's futures? Does that change their experiences? Does it change the mindset that they may have at their most formative moment when they're figuring out who they are, that they have to sort of deal with these systems of surveillance, deal with people seeing them as potential perpetrators instead of young people with opportunity and promise. And so we should think in our sort of actions and in our institutions, how do we perpetuate perhaps some of these same things, or do we sort of turn it around? And so what's great about The Wire is it brought to a wider audience, like these are ways in which we can see the human element of these young people, but I want to say in our everyday lives, how many of us are able to sort of see the human element on TV, but look straight through a young person as we walk past them on the street, to not see their humanity, to not think about the worlds of promise and potential that they have in them. And so I'm so delighted to kind of put these things on the table, get some substance from Dr. Desmond, and then talk with Mariame about what she's doing, and then bring the young people up to respond to it. So I want to turn it over to Desmond. Thank you.
Good morning. It's so good to be here. Like Dr. Shedd, I also spent a lot of time in Chicago as well. I did my dissertation in Chicago. And I started off initially really interested in urban education and the Black-white achievement gap. But in 2009, after watching the brutal death of Darren Albert, my trajectory changed in terms of my academic interests. So I became interested in the effects of community violence and how it impacts young people's well-being more generally, and in particular their educational outcomes. And so I did a dissertation study in Chicago looking at high-achieving young Black men and how they navigate violence on the west side of Chicago, but also maintaining strong grades as well. But as I stayed connected with those young men after I graduated, I learned so much about the different contexts and settings in which they were also navigating as well, to include social media. I, of course, knew a lot about social media, had several social media accounts, but I didn't understand the ways in which social media was impacting the lives of young people. And so much has changed as The Wire in terms of just how young people interact and communicate with one another. What we know from the Pew Institute for Research is that 92% of teens go online daily, and 71% of them have multiple social media accounts, and 24% go online constantly. So that's a lot of folks chatting online on a day-to-day basis. And so what we have is this context collapse where many young people are spending so much time online that their everyday life is spilling over into their online life. So some of you may be wondering, well, why is social media so appealing for teens? Well, this is a critical time in their development, and what we know about adolescent development is that peer relationships is an important piece of that, right? And so you want to be known to your friends. You want to interact with your friends. The conversations, the mall that was of my time as a teenager is now online. These things become vastly important during adolescent development. And so you have young people that are just bringing their everyday selves. They're putting a lot of personal details and personal information online in an effort to build community and to share information. But what happens when that everyday experience is also embedded within a local ecology of violence, right? And so in my own work now, I have been looking at what I call internet banking or cyber banking. And so I pursue two lines of work. I do interviews, ethnographic interviews with young people, and then I also do textual analysis of social media communications. And so I initially started this research agenda because I was interested in the extent to which social media could tell us about violence happening in communities. So that was my initial research question. But when I started to dig deeper, I realized that I was actually pursuing the wrong question. When I talked to youth about their online communication, I learned that they, oftentimes the more aggressive or tough talking that was happening online was not the beginning of the conversation. Oftentimes young people had experienced a massive amount of trauma and stress. They were grieving online, and they were using these platforms in order to communicate that grief. In one case study of a young female gang member, I learned that she had lost so many people in her life, and the only place in which she felt like she could communicate that was on Twitter. Now, this was a young woman that was also heavily gang involved, had allegedly 17 to 20 bodies associated with her by the time she was 17 years old. But on Twitter, she was very communicative and very emotional. She said things like, "People don't understand my pain. My pain has never been told." These are things that I think that are overlooked in our assessment and understanding of how young people are talking online. When I talk to young people and during interviews, I learned a lot about how young people conceptualize threats online, right? And so what happens is there are a lot of different institutions and groups that are surveilling young people's communication online. But do they have the same understanding and sensibilities as the young people who are actually the ones that are doing the encoding online? And what I learned is that they are very clear about what is threatening to them online. For once, they think about threats based on who is disseminating that threat. So if the individual is known in the community as being someone that is tough, that is gang involved, that has a reputation, then that communication was thought of as being more threatening. If the person also was able to make the communication a direct threat, meaning tagging someone's name in that communication or putting their address or a specific location, then that communication was thought of as being more threatening. However, there was a lot of confusion around the use of rap lyrics that I thought was really interesting, that I think is also a challenge as well. Many times police officers and adults in schools see rap lyrics on social media, and they immediately start to read into these lyrics as a confession or some kind of comment around threat or violence. And the young people were pretty clear that no, actually, that's not threatening. And I know it's not threatening because I can understand the rhythm and rhyme in the communication. I can understand the tenor of that communication, and it's not threatening to me. So if I saw that lyric online, then I wouldn't necessarily respond negatively to that as well. And so the ways in which young people are communicating, it's very clear that when things are direct, when they are specified in very clear ways, then their antennas go off, and then they're able to kind of pinpoint and map, where things are happening in their community based on those communications online. But the challenge with all of this, again, as I mentioned before, is that there's a ton of surveillance. There's a ton of adults that are not from these communities that are interpreting and trying to make sense of what is being said online. And I think that this is a part of the challenge as we're thinking about the school to prison pipeline. And so here in New York, we have Operation Crew Cut, as many of you are probably aware of, where instead of the wiretaps that we once had, the police are now able to surveil your social media communication for years. And so just last year, just north of campus here, there was the largest gang bust in New York City history of 104 young men of color that were indicted in criminal cases because of their communication online. But the challenge is, how do we make sense of intent in social media communication? What are the clues and context that we need to have in order to ascertain whether or not a communication is actually threatening? Well, this becomes really challenging because young people are constantly creating and curating their identity online and curating new ways of communicating with one another. What I learned in my research is that emojis are really important. Emojis can signify or amplify a good time. They can tell you they can amplify one's strong feelings about a sentiment. But also emojis alone can communicate a threat. But how do you know to what extent that emoji, that gun emoji, that bomb, that running man is something that is going to be indicative of a threat? This is a huge challenge in this work. So one way in which I think about this work is through the eyes, through a theoretical lens of Court of the Street. So some of you, or many of you, may be aware of Elijah Anderson's work, Court of the Street, in which he talks about one of the main reasons why people are interacting in the ways they do in their communities is because of respect, the desire to gain respect, right? And so for young people who are embedded in the context of violence, one way in which you can gain respect is through those communications online. So you may talk tough, you may post pictures with guns or posting gang signs in order to gain respect in your community, in order to protect yourself from invitations for injury or violence. That's how young people are interpreting their interactions online. But if you are an adult who is outside of that space, those pictures of guns, those pictures of gang signs may not encode the same way, right? And so those very moments that you think that you are just having general conversation online with other young people become those very moments that could lead to your criminal case. And so these are some of the challenges that we're having around social media that I think are particularly important when thinking about the school-to-prison pipeline. In my own research, I'm really trying to move this work forward to really understand in depth how young people are communicating. And I'm working with data scientists here at Columbia to see to what extent we can accurately detect and interpret communication online. And so I've hired youth in Chicago to be research assistants to be those interpreters of context, culture, and the nuances that are embedded in language so that they can tell us how things are moving, how we should interpret their behaviors online. And then I work with data scientists that can then identify those patterns in communication through natural language processing tools. And our hope is that we can then develop tools to alert violence interrupters, social workers, people like Mariame, to be able to know what is happening online in real time, to be able to intervene in ways that quell conflict and intervene in conflict in real time. So I'll be happy to talk more about this research, but this is just a gist of what I'm doing now.